When I was young, one of my favorite movies was Fern Gully, because it, in many ways, was part of my awakening as a cherub-faced eco-punk. My young, angsty self could not fathom why humans were content to clear-cut the world's most biodiverse and medicinal regions just to make cheaper McDonald's hamburgers. And, to be fair, my older self is still not much better at understanding this. In Fern Gully, I was like the goofy protagonist, experiencing a chance encounter, learning about the magical world of the fairies who serve as the forest's guardians. And as if through fairy enchantment, I got my first glimpse way back then of what my eventual purpose and passion would become. I spoke about this recently on the Soapbox podcast with Reverend Janglebones and Kurt Huggins, which was a really fun chat, by the way, and I've linked that episode in the show notes if you're interested. In the podcast, I described how Fern Gully drew me in, despite its overbearing 90s Captain Planet vibes, because of the underlying premise that there was still natural magic in the world, in wild, undomesticated places, like the rainforest. I assume this is what started my obsession with the rainforest and jungles in general, both in a conservationist sense, but also in my dreams. A later visit to the Yucatan in my teens added further inspiration, as well as potentially my first magical experience. The Yucatan is no rainforest, but we certainly have plenty of jungle here. I like to think of it as jungle light. There are far fewer poisonous or otherwise deadly creatures, great access to an international airport, and other conveniences. Still, when I'm in the jungle, listening to the wind whispering through the trees, or the hissing of a gentle rain through the canopy, or meeting the residents of these wild places, the world feels like a much more magical place than when I'm surrounded by the city and its residents, tourists, and other aspects of civilization. There is still natural magic in wild places. I've experienced firsthand the subtle ways the natural world opens up and engages with you as you earn its respect. And I've experienced the weird and synchronistic ways that spirit speaks to us in natural settings, through our interactions with the other beings in those places. I've felt the call to distant places in my thoughts and dreams and answered it, to arrive in this place at this time, and for a purpose beyond my own invention. I heard it during a mushroom trip of all settings, back in Dallas, in the early summer of 2020, before we moved here the following year. I was sitting in the backyard, having a lovely morning mushroom tea, when I heard a phrase as audibly as anything I've ever heard snap me out of a reverie. Increase biodiversity, it said, as if it were answering a question. My reverie a few moments before had been about something that had been bothering me mildly for a few days. I was trying to figure out why an orange that I left out by the tree in our backyard as an offering had sat completely untouched until it dried out and became desiccated. While you might not want ants to crawl up on your altar indoors for a snack, it just felt off to me that an offering that I left in nature, so to speak, it was my backyard really, or whatever, would go for so long without anyone taking advantage of it. Were my oranges poisonous? Were the spirits mad at me? Was there no life in my yard at all? These questions ran through my head for days, and eventually culminated in this moment of sudden inspiration, in the form of a literal voice in my head, with the realization that the answer to all my problems, the untouched offering obviously, but also the existential search for purpose and meaning that I was going through at the time, lie in the simple directive that I was given. Increase biodiversity. Well, it was straightforward at least. And so I did. Through my garden I worked to build not only a source of sustainable food for ourselves, but also to create habitat and to stabilize the environment to support more diverse forms of life. This inspiration sent me down a long rabbit hole of scientific and indigenous wisdom, as well as experimenting in the garden and studying permaculture, the result of which was to become completely obsessed with not just gardening, but the much grander idea of leaving our old lives to build a spiritual sanctuary and tropical food forest in the Mexican Caribbean, which is a place I've felt drawn to for many years. And it's very interesting that I should be given this directive, this particular divine inspiration, and feel drawn to this specific place. The Yucatan has suffered greatly over the last 100 years at the hands of colonizers, and it seems to me that part of my journey is to bring diversity and life back to a little corner of this tropical paradise. Not as a solution in itself, but as an example, living proof of what's possible with the right intention and the aid of natural magic. Fern Gully magic. In this episode, I'm going to share how this message from Spirit shifted the course of my life, how I have approached the often confusing nuances of working with nature spirits, and discuss practical applications for this kind of dirt sorcery, both in wild places and in your own backyard. Stay tuned for episode 14 in just a moment. Welcome to the 14th episode of the Postmugglism podcast, where we talk about magic in the postmodern world, look for ways to thrive and decline, and focus our energies on the better future that we all know is possible. My name is Nate, aka Postmugglism. This week I'm back with you after several long weeks of closing out old business in the US, which naturally timed itself in conjunction with the Aries-Scorpio eclipses that we just went through. Eclipses are always periods where doors are opening or closing for you. Important things or relationships begin or come to an end during these times. But the solar eclipse in Aries in particular signaled a period of fiery beginnings, and in my experience anyway, it did not disappoint. We were visiting the US primarily for the purpose of emptying our storage unit. And by the way, if you're ever moving to Mexico, don't leave anything in a storage unit in the US. It's not worth the hassle. But I digress. Regardless, we accomplished this goal, and even with a bit of good luck. We rented a U-Haul, emptied the unit into it, sold a lot of books, and donated a lot of household goods, furniture, and so on that we just couldn't figure out how to get back to Mexico. And then we drove that truck to Sarah's parents' house a few hours outside the city to drop off Sarah a few heirlooms and a ton of nostalgia and other miscellaneous possessions that still needed to be processed. Then I drove back to Dallas, and between Sarah, when she returned a week later, myself, and a friend from Dallas who was coming to visit us in Mexico directly after the trip, we muled back the remainder of our possessions. Then our normie friend who helped smuggle our stuff back visited for a week. Needless to say, the interruption in my state of flow was significant, and I'm just now getting back into the swing of things again. So I apologize for the empty weeks since I released my last episode, but I'm back, rested, recuperated, and refocused on producing this show. During the break, I had a lot of time to consider where to take this show next, and have had some promising inspiration that I'm still fleshing out, but look forward to sharing with you in time. For now, I'm just glad to be back and armed with another great episode ahead. In this episode, I want to talk about the kind of magic that venerates Mother Nature, about the call of wild places, about damaged ecosystems and ecopunk enchantments. I want to talk about the magic of making things grow, of striking deals with fairy folk, and learning how to act like a citizen of the more than human world, rather than one of its presumptive masters. When I first felt a tug in my spirit towards Mexico, it wasn't exactly the jungle that called me. Rather than the wild places, it was Mexico's inherent wildness, its rough and uncivilized edges that presented a potential pirate utopia. That came from a place of fear mostly, though. Fear of the current moment and its impact on liberty and personal autonomy. Before long, though, my preoccupation with which bad things might happen gradually shifted into contemplation of the opportunity that this moment actually represents. The world is changing rapidly, and those of us with good fortune, magically, on our side, can take advantage of the entropy of the moment to manifest the better futures that we want more quickly. After the fear settled into something more like aspiration, through a few months of intensive desire work, I emerged with a strong and somewhat unexpected desire to garden. At first, I was mostly concerned with the idea of resiliency, that is, trying to produce food organically and sustainably. And I more or less knew what to do. I'd gardened plenty when I was a kid and a teenager. But years of living in apartments had broken me of the habit despite having purchased a house about a decade prior. I quickly assembled a significant vegetable and herb garden in our side yard in Dallas and began amending the soil and planting seeds and starts. They sprang up as plants tend to do, but then stalled for a number of weeks with no action on top, but doubtlessly much going on in the dirt where the roots were finding their way around and allowing the plants to acclimate to the new environment. And it was about this time that we got the mushroom connection that led to my unusual inspiration to increase biodiversity. But this moment of spirit communication itself requires some additional context to understand. Spirit communication is easy to experience. As a matter of fact, you're experiencing it all the time as you think, create, and imagine. But if you're not accustomed to the subtle ways that spirit communicates through the world, much of this process is confusing and easy to miss. I was, at the time, much less comfortable with spirit communication than I've become since, and my attempts were embarrassingly overwrought as I look back now. But nevertheless, there I was trying too hard to communicate and not really knowing how to listen. So as part of my mushroom trips around that time, I was praying to the mushroom in advance, asking for help in breaking down this perceived barrier between myself and the spirit world, so that I could converse with the local spirits of place. And like a voice from the other side of a room, projected it came, loud and unforgettable. Increase biodiversity. Whatever the hell that meant. But actually, right away, I had an inkling of the importance of this simple instruction. The undisturbed sweet fruit that I left out for days should have been eaten by ants long ago, It should have been picked at by birds, at least. Something should have had its way with it, but that piece of fruit just lay there in condemnation of our altogether unnatural environment. And that shook me. It still feels strange, even now, to talk about that orange and the profundity of the message that I received and how damning it was, how uncomfortable. I had planted quite the array of different vegetables, so it's not like there was no diversity in species. But my embarrassment grew as I realized all of what was missing from the equation. My stalled plants were the key to understanding this cryptic message. My plants and Merlin Sheldrake's excellent book on the lifeways of mushrooms, Entangled Life, whose descriptions of the mycorrhizal networks and forest floors, known as the Wood Wide Web, finally put soil into perspective for me as a grower. You see, connections between plants and fungi and other plants form nutrient exchange networks that ensure mutual flourishing between species in this concept known as the Wood Wide Web. The fact is that when you plant in established dirt beds without tilling, your plants leap into production much more quickly than if you've just created your beds or you're planting in pots. The soil is essentially free of beneficial fungi when it's fresh, and it takes a few weeks for our fungal friends to acclimate and spread throughout the bed. Community is a vastly underrated factor in the health and resilience of living things, and not just the intra-species relationships between male and female specimens or in social groups and so on, but our health in particular is managed as a part of a collective within the local environment. We each host a civilization of microbiota within our guts and move through life in essential collaboration with these creatures. Essential because we could not function for even a day without these relationships. We also exist within a food chain, and luckily for us, we're close to the top, but nevertheless, much of our authority to act as we do extends from our role in that system. The community of beings that live in the soil, that grows the plants that we consume, or feeds the animals that feed us, is as essential to our survival as cows, chickens, potatoes, and the other things that make up our food. Biodiversity is how science describes how many species inhabit a local biosphere, and it has been well established that the entire system, all the species in it, become more resilient as the biodiversity, the number of species in the system, grows. To increase biodiversity brings more life into the local living system and distributes the positive effects throughout its community of beings, producing a rising tide that lifts all boats. Fungi naturally find their way into essentially every bit of soil eventually, their spores floating along until they come into contact with the appropriate organic matter. This will naturally bring diversity at the microbiotic scale, but when it comes to the larger scale ecosystem, the time frame it takes for nature to work her magic is beyond the scope of human patience. We can't help but involve ourselves in things like conservation, diversification, and cultivation, whether by our need for the products of the animals that we domesticate, or the plants that we cultivate, or our desire to bring the ecosystem back into balance. The result is the same. We're motivated to join forces with nature. And in this spirit, I began looking at my garden in Dallas in a very different light, more like a community which can only be enriched by improving lives on an individual basis. I planted herbs around my productive vegetables to keep pests at bay. I integrated totabodes and other habitat for beneficials, and planted flowers to attract pollinators. I inoculated the soil to speed up the microbial development, and the plants responded beautifully. A few weeks later, the garden was bursting at the seams, unrecognizable and thriving. And this is how biodiversity improves the resiliency of living systems. Much like with people, all living things are stronger together than they are apart. It took me a while to put it all together, but the untouched orange slices that started my reverie, in which I received my message, simply made me realize the unsettlingly unnatural condition of my yard, which is to say, my little piece of the world. Despite spending time growing things, which should ostensibly be good for the world, the way that I was gardening, from a place of fear and scarcity rather than joy and abundance, wasn't moving us into right relationship with the cosmos. It wasn't bringing us into coherence. And this coherence, this state of moving into right relationship, and moving because I don't think we're going to get there in our lifetimes, moving into right relationship aligns the field in support of your efforts. You start to meet all the right people, the resources you need become available, and fortune is on your side. This is where we all want to be, all the time, and this is where the universe wants us to be as well. The directive to increase biodiversity was as much about bringing myself and my family into a regenerative way of living as bringing balance to our ecosystem, but in so doing, we also learned how to contribute positively to the field, the connective tissue of energy that binds us to the greater community of beings that we live amongst in our local area. I came to realize that this framework for thinking and acting helps us understand a better and more essentially natural way to be in the world that showcases how we all benefit from greater diversity and competition, both individually and collectively. This understanding enabled me to produce remarkable results with the garden very quickly, with our own fruit and vegetable production primarily, but also by seeing how our neighbors' gardens blossomed in the following months. Gardening, it seems, is another example of collectives and the field effect. When I began to prioritize pollinators in my garden, the entire neighborhood enjoyed better germination rates as a result. This translates to a boom in blooms and much more enthusiastic gardeners. The effect is undeniably contagious. And this also tells us something important about personal callings and purpose-driven lives in these times of global catastrophe. Though we cannot change the world through direct action, our indirect actions can have wide-reaching effects through the field. My experimentation in the garden at our old house taught me many things in small laboratory settings that have informed my perspective on growing, the environment and therefore environmentalism, and our role as citizens instead of masters of this more than human community to which we belong. To be fair, these experiences were larger, more meaningful to my widened perception of them than they probably would appear to anyone else. But those days in the garden shaped my views, provided new lived experiences, and taught me to see the world around me as equal and alive with every sense of personhood, while also revealing quite clearly to me how we're all part of a greater planetary life form, and that we exist at both levels, and infinitely more between them, all at once, all the time. Not as cogs in some biological machine, but as informed participants within a collective, each self-actualizing and yet also contributing to the betterment of the collective as a whole. In 2020, the garden was a heavy lift to get off the ground, requiring lots of soil amendment and maintenance, and I was largely concerned with fruits and vegetables and a little bit with herbs and flowers. In 2021, though, it was almost the opposite. The garden took very little effort to get going in the spring because the soil was already in good condition and so on, and I let a lot of the plants reseed themselves, focusing much more on the herbs and flowers and attracting beneficial insects and amphibians and so on to further stabilize the garden and reduce my maintenance responsibilities. Partially this was because we were preparing to move, and it just didn't make any sense to have a bumper crop of squash ready to peak just in time to hand over the keys to the new owner. But it also afforded me a long, beautiful spring season where I could focus on bringing balance to the garden rather than trying to squeeze more productivity out of my space. And the effect was nothing short of magical. Where the air was relatively free of flying insects at the beginning of 2020, by spring of 2021, the garden was thick with friendly insects like dragonflies, lacewings, and bees patrolling for pests and or pollinating like greedy kids in a candy shop. Gardening was nearly effortless, growing things naturally with many plants reseeding from the year before, growing opportunistically and distributing themselves across many more beds in the garden, while pest control required minimal effort and everything just looked more lush and vibrant. Taking what I learned in those experiments and extending them into our new project, a tropical permaculture food forest, is not a straightforward matter though. The location is different, the weather and growing conditions, seasons, all very different, and my gardening practice will have to adapt as a result. What the future holds is different in a number of mostly exciting ways. We've purchased a larger piece of land with 2.5 acres of jungle to play with, and 75% of the square meterage will be untouched by our home construction. This gives us a lot of space to cultivate, landscape, and to create habitat within. There is a growing community of fairly like-minded people in the little jungle village we've purchased our lot of land in, and we're already forging relationships with the growers and spiritually minded people that live there. Climate and weather are different here, obviously, but it's bigger than that. Gardening in the jungle means making space in the canopy, which is a delicate matter. I don't want to go cutting down big old trees. But finding the right spots, keeping them manicured, etc. will matter for reasons that just didn't even exist in our backyard in Dallas. Domesticated plants will be a relatively small percentage of what's grown on our property, the larger portion going to trees, shrubs, vines, tubers, and so on, moving beyond gardening and into permaculture with its many levels and interactions between productive systems. The scope of this project goes far beyond my gardening experiments to date. There is certainly more room to play, more opportunity to build something impressive, but there are also many more factors to consider. You can't exactly water 2.5 acres efficiently. The topsoil is almost non-existent here, so composting, while totally possible, is also absolutely necessary. The jungle canopy filters 40 to 60% of the available light and will have to be maintained. Our lot is home to many creatures who rely on habitats which might be disturbed or destroyed by our improvements, and we may find that some of those same creatures love some of the same fruits and veggies that we do and might disrupt our supply. I've moved out of the laboratory and into the field now, and my expertise has been earned a lot through study, but only a little bit through practical experience. What comes next is my trial by fire, and in that fire, confidence and real expertise will be forged. And though it's rarely clear at the time, in retrospect, looking back over the last 3 years or so of this journey, It's fairly obvious to me the role that spirit, and particularly spirits of place, have played in charting our journey so far. Winding back the clock a very long way to my first fated moment with the spirits of the Riviera Maya. I was on a visit here with my father, and he, a fluent Spanish speaker, was introducing me to the other half, so that I could see how life was lived in some other place in the world than what I'd grown up observing. And good for him. During this visit, I experienced many firsts. Visiting a village in the jungle that we had to clear a path to reach by car, clearing an area to build with traditional chop and drop and fire management techniques, eating meals prepared over a campfire in our host's living room, and practicing Spanish among locals so native to the jungle that Spanish was their second language as well. Plus, of course, I visited Mayan ruins, had my first beer with my father, and other mind-expanding experiences. During this visit, we stayed in what was, at the time, a small town a little southwest of Tulum, and eventually visited the ruins at the famous tourist destination. In 1996, though, when we visited, there was essentially nothing compared to the tourist trap that exists today. The ruins, of course, were more or less the same, but far less trafficked by tourists at the time. And they lay right up against the edge of the rocky coastline which defines the middle stretch of the Riviera Maya, and for which the beaches in Tulum are quite famous. Following any of the meandering paths which tour the ruins will eventually lead to the highest point in the ancient port city, which commands its most celebrated view, the stone structure at its flattened peak, the limestone castle and lighthouse known as El Castillo. Just behind that structure is the seawall, lining the edge of a cliff probably 100 feet above the Caribbean, lapping up against its rocky buttress. The sight is objectively incredible, with the turquoise waters of the Caribbean meeting black volcanic rock punctuated by beautiful white sandy beaches. Overlooking this cliff, I had my first magical experience, though I didn't understand what was happening at the time, with a gut-churning sense of déjà vu or fate that overwhelmed me and then passed just as quickly, but left me affected, inexplicably imprinted by that experience, which has stuck with me for years. After that trip, the view from Tulum haunted me for years in my thoughts and dreams. It appeared in art projects like a volcanic rock that I carved into a planter that visually evoked the rocky shoreline with little trees clinging to its sharp edges like they were dangling off the side of a cliff. Tulum has beautiful sights, to be sure, but I've been a few other places and seen a few other beautiful views. Something about this place, this particular view though, and the magic of the tropical paradise that surrounds it, sunk its hooks to me in a way that I could never shake. Decades later, when Sarah and I started evaluating our options for international residency, Mexico was immediately at the forefront of my mind, and it quickly became our best option for many practical reasons. And at that time, the memories of this experience resurfaced into my conscious mind. Now, with the benefit of years of magical practice, the weighty, faded sensation of this experience was much clearer to me, and I began to put the pieces together. This place, and its beautiful Caribbean beaches, thick jungles, and dysfunctional government, have the makings of a pirate utopia that fulfills our requirements for anti-modern free living, and it has been calling to me in my dreams for decades. My obsession with the tropics and intensely biodiverse regions, and my déjà vu experience in Tulum, simply foreshadowed the inevitable spiritual connection that would eventually compel me to move here and serve a greater purpose. Thanks to a supply of very good mushrooms in the summer of 2020, as we were beginning our planning in earnest, I was able to explore these ideas in weird and wonderful ways. Now, I'm not a fan of listening to people's unintelligible psychedelic experiences, so I'll spare you the nonsensical details, but the impression that they left me with was clear enough, particularly in the first of those revealing trips where I received that clairaudient clue, increase biodiversity. But over the subsequent trips, I also received a variety of other messages and images that have stuck with me since, like a vision of our future home, of a future version of myself, and interactions with various manifestations of an extremely feral version of the sacred feminine. In the end, it all tied together, the eco-punk obsessions of my youth, a decade's dormant love of growing things, my dreams of Mexico, and my increasingly deepening magical practice. I learned quickly that the tranquility I found in gardening was the perfect platform for deepening my connection to nature and her spirits. And given the intensity of my calling to this place, it seemed necessary to find a way to establish contact with her spirits before our family undertook our grand venture. To that end, I flew to Mexico on a recon trip in December of 2020, walking around the areas that I thought we might want to live in and getting to know them a little better. I also had planned to attempt to communicate with the spirit of the city of Tulum because of my experiences at the Tulum ruins. My first night, I wandered down the long Koba Avenue to the first quiet, mostly empty beach hotel without a gate or a security guard and snuck out onto their little bit of beach. There I lit a cigar, said a prayer to Hecate, sipped on a bottle of rum, and poured some out for the spirits in my baby attempt at calling on the spirits of place. Fortunately, beginner's luck carried me, and I quickly entered an altered state and started having a vision of sorts, a flurry of mental images, really, of Spanish galleons and modern-day faux spiritual bros, as if juxtaposing the past and the present in an attempt to warn me of the area's ongoing problems with Western colonialism. Impressed by the experience itself, but a bit deflated from the unavoidably negative vibes that I was getting, I focused my exploration in the following days in other cities along the coast and kept an especially open mind. But before leaving Tulum, I bought some dirt with a few coins and my good intentions from a spot in the city that was close to my hotel. Once back in the States, I put that dirt in a little bottle and placed it on our road opening altar along with pictures of various places in the Yucatan, touristy knickknacks from a prior visit, and our vision board where we kept various images that helped us to visualize our future home in the jungle. With a lot of effort and repetition and inspiration from the works of Claude Lecateau and bits of Gordon White's Fairy Course, I chaos magicked my way into something of a relationship with whatever spirits would attend the dirt that I procured in Tulum. First, this was at a distance, and then once we were here in Mexico, we were able to develop a deeper and more obviously apparent relationship with the now local spirits of place. And as we honed in on our spot in the jungle over months of searching and exploring the area, we bought more dirt, first at a crossroads in the village, and then from our actual lot before we closed on it. We'd visit the crossroads and leave offerings and prayers almost once a week during our search, and since we've found our property and have had a survey team cut a path to it, we've been going regularly to leave offerings at a particularly sacred tree. I justify the authenticity of our experiences based on the uncannily good fortune that we've experienced along the way. We've moved into the same neighborhood that we were first shown by our real estate agent, who is also a university-trained biologist and an independent educator who teaches organic gardening in the tropics, herbalism, and other subjects that are remarkably relevant to us on this journey. Our vecino, or neighbor to the north, who is building eco-friendly glamping spots across the road from our property, is a self-made guy who builds structures for local cenotes, sweat lodges where temazcal ceremonies are held, and stuff like that, and just generally knows all about jungle construction. He came to find me one day and offered to collaborate on completing the road that he had already started, that now ran adjacent to the property and just needed to be connected with the main road, and on other essential projects like coordinating with the electrical company Cefe to install power poles and a transformer to run electricity to our little corner of the neighborhood. Because when you're building in the virgin jungle like we both are, it's kind of a DIY thing. To put it in perspective, I've spent 6 months trying to get a corporate bank account set up successfully. But I was able to build a road in only 4 days because of the extremely good fortune of meeting our neighbor. And that's just one example. This project is not an easy undertaking, but we're being moved along gracefully on the winds of fate, and that's pretty hard to deny from where we're sitting. The Yucatan has a long history, and if you're willing to entertain the ideas of writer and alternative historian Graham Hancock, the so-called Mayan civilization was only the last in a lineage of massive civilizations, including Aztec, Olmec, and potentially at least one much older civilization that predates the last ice age. What we see when we visit the jungles of the Riviera Maya today is a beautiful but thick and scruffy jungle, and particularly near the road and other construction, this has become coarse hedges of impenetrable greenery. It gets very, very dry in the heat of the summertime, and sometimes forest fires can be a real problem. Locally, the Yucatan jungle is described as having 3 subclassifications: low, medium, and high jungle. So-called high jungle means that the canopy is very high up, which requires very big and very old trees, and deep roots which can draw up the vast quantities of nutrients that tall trees require. The big trees in these areas shed massive quantities of leaves, creating compost on the forest floor which develops into 6 to 12 inches of really high-quality topsoil. In contrast, medium and low jungle areas are predictably the opposite, with low canopies and very, very little topsoil, just limestone in most places. This makes them hotter, drier, and very challenging for growing food and raising animals, as well as more of a fire hazard. The area where we've acquired our land is considered high jungle, and we're fortunate to have big trees and the beginnings of topsoil. Even so, biodiversity in this area is relatively low for a tropical jungle. There are probably around 5 or 6 species of trees which make up the bulk of the flora in the jungle, aside from the brush and the vines and so on. Compared to rainforests, which are the Earth's most biodiverse regions, it seems oddly dissonant that a place only a little warmer and drier should be so starkly different. And it should feel strange, because the effect is entirely the result of poor forestry management, many times over, from the fall of the Mayan Empire in roughly 900 AD, when deforestation was at an all-time peak, then experiencing regrowth from then to the 1930s and 40s when the Chico Zapote sap harvesting was popular and the first ejidos, or indigenous farmer land grants, were issued. Population increase and sap harvesting drove deforestation again for several decades, and then this was exacerbated in the 1960s through the 1980s with logging and large-scale industrial projects. And from that point until the current day, rising population, particularly in Merida, Cancun, and along the Caribbean coastline, are driving the expansion of cities and clearing of jungle land as a result. Even the indigenous farmers granted ejidos, which are basically large tracts of untitled jungle which are managed by communities of families local to the area, well, they only practice a highly degraded form of farming and forestry management, producing only an impoverished shadow of the cultivated jungles of the ancient Olmecs. Colonialism objectively raped this tropical paradise, and the bad habits of extractive land management extend even further back into the history of the collapse of the prior civilization, the Mayans. After each extractive period, deforestation is reversed gradually through rewilding, but forests don't regrow naturally under such unnatural conditions. Instead, the gaps in the canopy created by opportunistic logging and clearing for construction are first filled with invasive pioneer species, and after 40 to 100 years, if undisturbed, the heritage species have an opportunity to propagate sufficiently, and eventually balance will be restored. This is a long process, however, and the periodic and partial deforestation due to ejido inhabitation, farming, sap extraction, logging, and other factors has encouraged perpetually young or new growth to fill in the gaps between bigger and vastly more ancient trees. Visible traces of extensive sap harvesting crisscross probably over 100 trees on our property, vestiges of the 1930s and 40s, which demonstrates the age of many of the 202 bigger trees on our jungle lot. And between each pair of older trees, spread maybe 5 meters apart on average, could be anywhere from a few small trees to several dozen, all small saplings stretching up towards the canopy in thin, unsustainable poles. There are so many of these little saplings throughout the jungle that small, stripped, and varnished poles are frequently used for making little fences and decorative elements in local tiki bars and palapas and such. There is a seemingly inexhaustible supply of these, but serious hardwood for construction is very expensive despite the endless green jungle all around us. According to a study by environmental protection agency Pro Natura, deforestation has become so widespread that the Yucatan has lost between 60 and 70% of its biodiversity over the last 100 years. It would be difficult to find a place still so wild, so beautiful, and also this damaged. The brutal colonial history of the Yucatan is an injury from which the peninsula is still recovering ecologically. Unfortunately, demand for real estate and modernization around cities and along the coastline is continuing to drive up deforestation with no signs of slowing. Even in our own future neighborhood, we can see the telltale signs of development. 10 kilometers away, the Fern Maya project is carving an ugly path of progress through the jungle, and it's only a matter of time until developments spring up around it, populating our quiet little corner of the jungle. This is why we were encouraged by our spirit team to buy a couple of acres, enough to lose ourselves in, where we could remain surrounded by jungle on all sides of us, on our own property. And it's why we're located in the middle of cenote country, where construction is limited to small, single-family residential buildings. The area where we've chosen to live is protected in a way that much of the Yucatan is sadly not. It'll retain its green cover and quiet ambiance, regardless of the train project and encroaching civilization. And we're very lucky for that. And the state of the Yucatan jungle represents a unique opportunity for people like us, because in its damaged condition, there's little danger that thoughtful, respectful cultivation of native and adoptive plant and tree species will do any kind of damage at all to the natural flora. In fact, the increase in biodiversity will actually benefit the local ecosystem tremendously by offsetting some of that staggering biodiversity loss I mentioned just a moment ago. We were led by our spiritual encounters to the high jungle with old, tall trees that drop a blanket of carbon on the ground every single day, enriching the shallow but excellent soil, and whose deep roots draw up the rich mineralized cenote water a few meters under the limestone surface. There is an essentially endless supply of this water, and an equally enduring supply of bright, sunny days in our warm tropical climate. It's a wonderful growing climate, with a lot of pluses when it comes to local resiliency. The only problem is the encroaching westernization of the touristy beach towns, now reaching deeper into the jungle, and It's to this unique setting that we've been led through visions and divination, spirit communication, and divine inspiration. And all along the way, I've been primed and prepared for the task of cultivating our little piece of jungle to increase its biodiversity, to aid in its flourishing, and to demonstrate the potency of the resulting field effects. I share our stories and my own path from Western materialist to dirt sorcerer in the jungle as an example of how fate, destiny, and spirit weave our stories together over remarkable distances of time and space. A fated encounter in my youth that haunted my dreams for decades eventually germinated into a burning desire to leave the U.S. and pursue a different kind of life. Divine inspiration, psychedelics, and spirit communication shaped that desire into a plan of sorts, which diligence and good fortune have turned into a significant work in progress. Small moments of great profundity along the way increased the fidelity of my perception, allowing me to both move and grow at once, gaining understanding of my purpose in transit to the next phase of this grand adventure. An undisturbed offering, a clairaudient message, metaphorical visions, fortunate encounters, and time spent in the wild guide this process, ensuring that we are where we need to be at just the right moments to bring this future gradually into being. It's an interesting experience to be driven to something so dramatically, but without a clear understanding of what exactly you're being driven to in the end. Yet, this is the way that life works. We rarely know where the road that we're on will take us, and yet we're excited for the journey anyway. In every magical working, there are two sides, transacting a form of business with something like currency, through the quid pro quo of reciprocity. It is a negotiation where each side accepts certain duties and responsibilities in exchange for the same from the other side. In some cases, concentrated energy in the form of prayer and intention is exchanged for divine intervention in our lives, such as with astrological magic or theurgy. In others, though, the exchange is less hierarchical, less top-down, and more horizontal and collaborative. Spirits of place, in my experience, are powerful in their own environments, but comparatively weak at a distance. Being in place, working collaboratively with its spirits, and living in a state of reciprocity and mutual respect with the environment, the more than human world around you, re-enchant your experience of life in a way that is much greater than the sum of its parts. Living this way, and the closer that you live to wild places, the more that this is true, moves you into a flow state where your fortunes are tied to the fortunes of the place. Its spirits help you, and you help its spirits. This is the foundation of dirt sorcery, or nature magic, from which we can build the better future that we all know is possible, in collaboration with the more than human world, rather than in domination of it. But what is this dirt sorcery capable of? From my own lived experience, I can say confidently that working closely with spirits of place is an essential part of being the custodian or human occupant of it, and particularly so in wild places. And before that, finding the right bit of land for your dreams to come true on is something that they should at least be consulted about. Paying respects, providing a place of honor for them, and preserving wild places are absolutely necessary when attempting to live in this manner. Arranging for protection, good fortune, and the resources you need to construct and live on the land are possible and advisable when maintaining an active relationship with your local spirits. Support with growing things, solving problems on the land, and being introduced to the plant and animal inhabitants also comes with this territory. Finding hidden features and the best places to build, meeting helpful people and building community, weather, fire, and disaster protection, and I suspect also things like attracting certain plant and animal species, remaining hidden or invisible, healing human and non-human inhabitants, all the various aspects of caring and guarding or tending the local community are on the table. While this isn't like the magic of the stars, dramatic, narrative-driven, and entropic, the subtler natural magic of the living and yet incredibly haunted world has its own unique value that we've almost completely forgotten. I think of these two polar opposites, the celestial magic of the heavens or the sky, and the terrestrial magic of the earth, as complementary and interweaving. Sky magic is of the supernal Father, and earth magic is of the Divine Mother. One is cosmic and chaotic, and the other terrestrial and grounded. Individually empowering versus collectively nurturing. Dominant versus receptive. Yang, yin, and so on. Don't get me wrong. I regularly tap into the power of the planets and the stars to accomplish my goals, and when it comes to the Olympian dramas of human life, power, sex, fame, glory, conquest, and so on, this is where celestial or astrological magic excels. But when it comes to healing, growing, building, nurturing, evolving, and improving the collective. It is earth magic, dirt sorcery, that we need. My experiences along this wild and wonderful journey into the jungle have exposed me to ways of living and of solving problems in the world that cannot function amongst hegemony, centralization, and materialism. They require the magic of place, which is different everywhere, and of collective intention towards better futures, and of group ceremony, which ensures the coherence and cultivation of the collective, mutual flourishing, in which the measure of the richness of its biodiversity is the fulcrum by which equilibrium is naturally maintained. The sheer improbability of nature's endless array of such equilibriums is the self-evident proof of the power of her magic. Years into it, our journey into the jungle is only really beginning just now, but now we can see the road ahead much more clearly, more of its fast-approaching details coming into focus all the time. As we head into that future, the magic we've already experienced on this journey gives us confidence that whatever we need along the way, we can always call upon the magic of nature and her spirits to provide. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Postmugglism podcast. This is a fun story to tell because it's my own, and I've enjoyed reliving these moments with you, and it's been useful to summarize it all like this for myself as well, to remind myself of all the magic along the way. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast so that you get notified each week when I release new episodes. And for all my other content, like articles, videos, and so on, visit my website at www.postmugglism.com and sign up for my free newsletter in the sidebar. If you subscribe there, you'll see everything that I publish, regardless of what platform it's on. I hope my story inspires, or at least entertains you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts either on social media somewhere where you can usually find me as Postmugglism, or by email at postmugglism@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. All right, thanks again for spending this time with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.